So what is safeguarding? So safeguarding refers to, and this is out of Wikipedia, the measures that are taken, so like policies and our actions to protect the health and well-being and human rights of individuals. And that it allows especially children and vulnerable adults to live and participate free from harassment, abuse, harm, and neglect. And vulnerable adults can be categorized as the female population, LGBTQ plus population, the elderly can be vulnerable adults. People with a disability would be classified as vulnerable adults. So anyone, where it's are more vulnerable than the kind of general population. Policy purpose states equivocally that it's to ensure that golfers can take part in golf without fear of harassment or abuse, and that the key objectives is to ensure that everyone understands that all forms of harassment and abuse are unacceptable and will not be tolerated, and that anyone who has witnessed or experienced harassment can report the incident without fear of victimization or retaliation, and that there will be an appropriate and a coordinated response, and we'll talk through that, and that we implement measures to try and minimize the likelihood of incidences and harassment and abuse arising. So things like education, starting to talk about the subject matter. We'll talk through some vetting protocols. Why safeguard? So the risk of failing to safeguard can be really high. And that is if you don't try to safeguard everyone, and I know the majority are clubs that are on this call, the members of your clubs or the people who are coming through your clubs, like, first of all, the physical and emotional damage that happens to children and vulnerable adults when they are harassed or abused is incredibly damaging. We'll see later, high risk of reputational damage to your organization, which can lead to, and we'll talk to this as well, incredible financial damage, as well as criminal proceedings. So I'm not sure in golf how many people have heard of the Larry Nassar case, but Larry Nassar was the chief medical officer for Michigan State University, USA Gymnastics, and USA Olympic team. And he pled guilty to only 7 counts of criminal sexual conduct. But he was made to sit through the counts of 150 victims in court, who testified to the sexual abuse that he had inflicted on them while working at Michigan State University, USA Gymnastics, and the USA Olympic Committee. He was sentenced to 60 years in federal prison and between 40 and 175 years in state prison. And the reality is that how he was allowed to continue, even though these victims had been telling all of these organizations, was literally their win at all costs mentality, because money were more important and there was a huge power imbalance. And, further consequences from a financial point of view is that immediately, when the case came out, Michigan State University settled with the victims for $500 million. USA Gymnastics filed for bankruptcy, and eventually last year, them and the Olympic Committee settled for $380 million with the survivors. And just last week, following a Department of Justice investigation into the FBI, who also failed to respond to these victims, and they've just awarded $139 million compensation to the victims. And that was because nobody reacted when the victims came forward. So Another reason why we have to safeguard is because it is literally legislated in our legal system. So those are all of the references to acts in our legislation relating to safeguarding, which includes the Children's Act, the Criminal Law Amendment Act, which relates to sexual offences, and our Constitution just speaks to the basic rights of human rights of being treated equally and with respect. Really, it is all of our duty of care to do no harm. And by saying do no harm, it also means what it means is we do also have to take action, because if we do nothing, the fact that we are doing nothing is an action of harm. So it's not just do no harm, it's do everything act in every way in our power to protect. So how do we safeguard? I'll come to the slide again a bit later, but just to kind of bring in the concept is really we start by developing a policy which has a responding mechanism in order for us to respond to the subject. We do prevention, so doing our vetting, making sure we have codes of conduct and ethics and disciplinary codes. We do education to promote and understand across the sector as much as possible, and then we monitor and evaluate, look at what we're doing and update our policy and our responding mechanisms. And so this is a continuous cycle that never, ever, ever, ever stops in this subject. And we try always think and keep our athletes and our vulnerable at the center and try and ensure that we do this in a trauma-informed way. So I'm going to head into just explaining and going through the GolfRSA policy section. So we have our safeguarding policy and it's been broken up into 10 different subsections that go with it. So it's all one policy, but to try and make it a bit easier to read and digest and also refer to the different sections, we've broken it up into 10 different subsections that go with it. So there's an introduction behind all of the policy as to why we safeguard, and then I'm going to go through each of the sections around the reporting protocols, the recruiting and vetting, safe golf and coaching, club and safeguarding guidelines, in communication and social media, travel, photography, types of harassment and abuse, and then recognizing harassment and abuse and poor practice. In the reporting protocols and procedures, this lays out how, if a report comes to GolfRSA, this is how we will manage it. So if a club safeguarding officer receives a complaint, they can send the complaint to us as GolfRSA safeguarding officer if they can't handle it themselves. If they are able to handle the matter themselves, and we just request that we get an outcome of the concern that has arisen, more just so that we can follow trends of what's happening in the golfing industry, and also because we might have coaches who are working at 5 different clubs, and if there are reports coming up about a specific coach in 5 different areas, we won't necessarily know about it unless there's a coordinated and almost central place keeping the data. So a complaint comes to us as the safeguarding officers. We have a specific email, safeguarding@golfrsa.co.za. We make sure we have as much of the details as possible, and then we pass it on to an independent case management panel. So as I introduced, Haley's one of the people on the case management panel with her experience in safeguarding. We also have a lawyer and someone from sport who understands golf but is independent in the industry, and they will then look at the report and advise us as safeguarding officers how to then proceed. And that might be just some education is needed, or to collect some more information, or potentially there is an independent investigation that's needed, and then an independent investigating officer would need to be brought in and then report back to the case management panel. If they then decide that there is a case to answer, then the case would be taken to a disciplinary panel, which could either be independent or made up of the case management panel, just to try and keep as much confidentiality as possible. And once that process is run through, then there's always a right to appeal. So that is the procedure that would take place in dealing with cases. With responding to your concern, if you receive a report of abuse at club level where you feel that a child or an adult is in immediate danger, then you don't go through this process of going to the case management team and checking. You contact the police or social services immediately. So reporting to the safeguarding officer can at a national level can then happen afterwards. If there is a crime that is suspected, then you can refer to the police, and if they're at risk, then to social services. It is the law that any crime against a child has to be reported. So I'm just going to pause there, because that's just the end of the first kind of section of the reporting, and I just want to see if there are any questions, if anyone wants to raise their hand, queries around, and Hayley, if there's anything you want to add to just that section. Paul? Go for it, Paul.
Sorry. You say that you request that it get reported, so there's not a requirement. Should it not actually be a requirement?
It is a report.
So if something happens in your club environment with regards to safeguarding in that, you mentioned request. A request and a requirement, obviously.
We very much like it a requirement that you do report.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think that the terminology should be stronger, that it becomes a requirement that people are expected to report it, I think.
Yes.
Okay.
Please. And it's not for judgments on your club or anything that happens in it. Sure. It really is to keep the industry safe. So yes, thank you for emphasizing that.
I think, and if I can also just, it's probably a bit premature, but in a multi-sport facility, it becomes a bit more complicated, because tennis and squash and all the sports have got their own safeguarding committees and things like that. So, is there not a national country club one?
So that's a great question. And I see Roxanne is on the call. I know that she is working with Hayley to help the club industry in exactly that type of space, where you have these multitudes of sports in one facility. So maybe let her carry on. But I think just from a reporting, it's a great time to bring it up as well. From a reporting point of view, obviously, if something happens within your club in the golf section, we do need to know. But it is an interesting discussion point around a coordinated response. And I think maybe Hayley can talk to this also from SASCOC and sports side, is many times if there are coaches, they're jumping between sports as well. And if sports are not talking to each other, or clubs are not talking to each other, how are we, responding together to close down the opportunity of perpetrators running through? So at this stage, we require you to tell us about the golfing side, but we do need a smart, coordinated approach across sports. So I think maybe I'll let Roxanne talk first, and then maybe Hayley wants to add.
I think, and particularly when because I think potentially a lot of the issues could arise in shared facilities, so locker rooms and places, restaurants, or in clubs and that. So it does become a multi-sport thing, and not necessarily actually involving a particular sport per se, but
Sure. Roxanne?
Yes, thanks, Paul. So what we've done is we've reached out to Hayley and made the introduction, because we've realized there obviously is a space for club management, because there's so many policies that are going to be coming through, and we're going to look at how we can have an operational policy on safeguarding and then bring all the sporting codes in. So we've still got a bit of work to do with Hayley, but I presume what we would do, for example, for locker room, is we would possibly have a look at what each sporting code is doing and make a recommendation that takes them all into account without confusing everybody. We're going to obviously address like the children's areas. We're going to address anything that's not covered in the policies as well. So we do have some work to do, Paul, but it's definitely something that we are hoping to also roll out in the next possibly 3 or 4 months.
Hayley, is there anything else you want to add?
Hi, everybody. Yeah, I think in terms of sport as a whole, SASCOC is putting huge pressure on every federation. No federation can continue under SASCOC's ambit or in sport without safeguarding policies and procedures in place. There is a sense of trying to help all sports standardize their responses and their policies so that they can interact well with each other. One of the other things we are looking at within SASCOC is to see how we can register perpetrators of sport, particularly where it's coaching and administrative staff, so that when somebody moves to a different sport, there is an easy way to check across the various sporting codes if there has been a history. So that's they're busy looking at the legal framework around that. Our constitution kind of restricts some of what we can do there, and to try and structure almost a register of coaches and administrators in sport so that we can prevent that moving across from one discipline to another. I do think in terms of club management, and it's part of the conversation we've had, is each federation, each sporting code needs to take responsibility for what they can definitely do within their control, and then to hold accountable and ask the questions for what is not within their control. So where you are sharing facilities is to check things like, are all the staff at the facility where your young people will be vetted and so on, and to negotiate that and manage that. So definitely it needs to be a collaboration between the local kind of sporting codes as well as club management to get that overall. I do think the challenge is in not having any one particular sporting code dictate to everyone else within that club of how they've got to be compliant. What compliance needs to be there will need to be there, but the how in that needs to be left a little bit open to each individual sporting code. So I think that's pretty much it for me now.
Thanks, Hayley. So the next section is, as it's kind of been alluded to, is the safe recruiting and vetting. So one of the very important things is that to vet all persons who work with children and in the industry against all 3 registers. So there's not just a criminal record clearance, which you can do at PostNet, and get your results in 24 hours. But there is also the sexual offences register clearance, which you do at the Department of Justice. Currently, it's taking 3 weeks to get those clearances, and that's through the Department of Social Development, which at the moment is taking 3 months. So I know that the PGA has gone through all of this, and then the recommendation is that it's redone every 2 years. And if you go through an agency, then the agency collects your fingerprints, so then they've got them on record, and so they can just reuse them going forward. So it's just filling out the paperwork again in 2 years' time and waiting for the new clearances to come up. The process has got a little bit lengthier. So you do have to have the original forms now sent to the agency. So it does seem to be a lot more admin intensive. But until the end of last year, the Department of Justice wasn't actually even operational. So this is, it's taken great strides forwards. And if you are using an agency, we have to recommend that you make sure that the certificates, the criminal record clearances, the sexual offences register, and the child protection register clearances come on those departments' letterheads, not on the agency's letterheads or a third party's letterheads. We also place in the policy that you really should get references for all your employees, even your current ones, and especially obviously new employees, and that you contact them. And unfortunately, sometimes because of previous cases, there are non-disclosure agreements in place. And so it's often recommended that if you phone them for a recommendation, and unfortunately there's a non-disclosure in place, they're not going to tell you if there's any, if you ask them straight to say anything, they can't unfortunately tell you. A good question to ask is, if you had the opportunity to employ this person again, would you? Because they can just say yes or no without needing to divulge any and breach any non-disclosures. And then it is really essential to do awareness education for all your staff, and that would be anyone who's interacting. Phil Dugatun is quite a specialist in this area. He was the safeguarding officer for Arsenal Football Club, and they educated everyone from the groundskeeper to the ushers who used to show people to their seats at Arsenal football games. And he has regurgitated stories to us about the ushers actually bringing to alert and uncovering. Well, they didn't uncover, they brought it to his attention, and he was able to uncover a syndicate of people who were using the elderly to get tickets and actually stealing money from them out of the old age home and going to the Arsenal football games. And another story around a groundskeeper who managed to pick up that a child in the academy was actually being abused at home just by understanding the subject matter. So I'm going to pause here again to just unpack and just ask Hayley to talk a little bit more about the vetting side of things.
So I think the biggest thing with vetting is to find the way that works best for you and your organization. As Anne said, you can do the criminal record checks. You don't need to do a SAPS police clearance. In fact, the SAPS police clearance is not accepted by the Department of Justice for the sexual offences register check. So it is better to do the clearances through AffiSwitch, which you can do through Postnet or any other AffiSwitch agent. And there are agents right across the country who can assist, but there are some agents who are willing to come out to a club or to an event and sit there and do the vetting while everybody is already there, which makes it a lot easier than trying to get people to go somewhere and get it done. If you are going to do your first step, do the criminal record check and then receive the AffiSwitch result. And then the second step is to do the sexual offences register, because that AffiSwitch criminal record check result needs to be submitted with the Form 7 that goes to the Department of Justice. So they won't accept a fingerprint file, which is what it says on the form, but that doesn't mean you go to a police station and have fingerprints taken. It means you need the final result, a SAP 69 result of what criminal records the person does or does not have. The advantage of using an agency to help you with this is that all those forms need to be taken in person into social development and to justice. So it means going in, sitting there at the department, receiving a receipt to say that that form has been submitted, and then being able to go and collect it once it is ready, and also to nag them to get it ready. For social development, the child protection register check, there's two different ways of doing it. There's what we call a Form 29, which is for an organization applying for people within the organization. So you apply on behalf of the people within the organization. that is filled in, and certified copies of the IDs for each individual is attached to that. Or you can do a Form 30. So Form 30 is an individual applying on their own behalf, and that they also need to attach certified copies of IDs. Department of Social Development don't really like doing the Form 30s. They prefer doing Form 29s. However, if you have somebody who is coaching and teaching and doing things in various places, then a Form 30 makes more sense for them. Otherwise, they need to submit a Form 29 for each organization they're part of. So what we generally recommend is if somebody fulfills multiple roles where they're working with young people, that they submit a Form 30 and get that result back and share that certificate with all their respective organizations that they need it for. However, where you've got clubs and staff and that kind of stuff, a Form 29 makes more sense. Then the organization gets a single certificate with all the names listed on it and whether they're clear or not on the Child Protection Register. The challenge with that is POPI does not allow us to share that certificate with other people because it's got other people's information on it, and that's why the Form 30 becomes an option. If you want to send your team to a PostNet, again, there's two options. They can go to PostNet and do the clearance directly with PostNet and then submit their own Form 29s and Form 30s. Alternatively, what they can do is use an agency, and then what happens then is if the agency is registered with Huru, they can go and do their fingerprints at PostNet, but they do the rest of the process and the payment through the agency, and then they courier the documents to the agency, who then submits, once the results are through, submits everything to the various government departments and picks up those certificates for them. The vetting, often we get asked the question around educators, because a lot of educators have got their SACE. SACE is not adequate in terms of what you need for sport, and just because an educator has been registered with SACE doesn't mean that their criminal checks are recent. Your organization, in order to be compliant, has to have copies of those certificates on file. So if they cannot issue you with the Child Protection Register check, Sexual Offences Register check to keep on file, and the criminal record check, then it's not a valid certificate. So they need to redo it. And this is often an argument that we see in sport, especially if you have links in with school sport. So every single person that is working with anybody under the age of 18 needs to have their vetting done, needs to have a copy of that on file. You should have that available at any tournaments and things like that as well. And in terms of people traveling overseas now and competing overseas, SASCOC's latest directive is that even the athletes over 18, if they are traveling with minors, have to be vetted as well. So for the Olympic Games now and for Africa Games, all the athletes over 18 who will be staying in the athletes' village have also had to do all their vetting and submit that to SASCOC before they're allowed to participate as part of Team South Africa. I hope that answers all the questions, Anne.
Thanks, Hayley. What we do plan to do is to send out this week a separate just document around the vetting and which forms, and Hayley's got a really good thing that she did for the Olympics and with the processes, so that the clubs can have that on file. So there are various choices in how you would like to go about doing it, and to just get on it, and then have your reminder every 2 years to just then re-go through the process again. So then the next section in the policy deals with safe golf and safe and coaches. And essentially in coaching, you can look at it in having three different, you have poor practice, which often happens on a daily basis. Around, it's not just around coaching, but also just management. And if this isn't addressed, it lays the foundation for then unacceptable conduct. So unacceptable conduct would really be around breaches of codes of conduct, that level of unacceptable behavior, and then you obviously get criminal conduct. And with all due respect, if somebody is going to commit a crime, it's not always in your control to stop it. But the more that poor practice is dealt with on a daily basis closes down the opportunity for those perpetrators who are coming into any type of club or sport, who are coming with the intent to commit a crime. The more that their poor practice and their grooming process is closed down, the less likely they are to continue up to unacceptable conduct and then ultimately criminal conduct. So we really do need to, so it talks to, you know, kind of the poor practice side of things. The only other thing to note is that it is, again, recommended that there is a rule of 2. I know that in golf, it's a lot of one-on-one coaching, but in a club environment, I imagine that a coach is never often secluded in a environment where they are one-on-one, like in a room alone with an athlete. So it's really around just, you know, having open spaces, having other people who can see what's happening around that. So, but it is around just being aware that the rule of 2 is that it's best practice to not have a one-on-one situation with an athlete and a coach, that there should be 2 athletes with a coach. And if there's a group of athletes, that there's 2 adults there. In some of your higher risk sports, some of the reasoning behind that is also that if there is an emergency and somebody has to be rushed to the hospital, that there's another adult to look after the, even if it's not a coach, that they can all just sit down and be safe and supervised. So with clubs and safeguarding, I don't know if I want to, is there anyone with their hand up or would like to ask a question around this section? You can also just unmute yourself and ask before I move on. So the next section, oh yes.
Sorry.
Yes.
From my side, if we look at junior IPTs or management of teams, how will that affect us in future? Is this an imminent thing that more than one will have to be present, or is this only coaching wise, or is it same as with management of teams?
So with regards to like the management of teams in an IPT, you've obviously got a number of athletes. So it's not having, so there's nothing wrong with having one manager with a group of athletes, because there's more than one athlete. It's whilst you're on the tour, you should never be one-on-one with an athlete in a closed room, if that makes sense.
Okay, thanks. Yep, that makes sense. Thank you.
So the next section is around clubs and safeguarding. So it's essential that the clubs look at having a safeguarding officer or 2 or 3 within your club, that they are trained up to understand the subject matter, to how to respond, how to receive a complaint or a concern. But essentially, this officer is like it's also like your health and safety officer. The biggest thing that they do around your club is look at is assessing the risk. So where are the risk areas within your club? You know, what is the situation with the changing rooms? What's your policy around late collections? Or, you know, if a coach is coaching and the athlete's parents haven't come to fetch them, what's the protocol that's happening within the club with regards to those potentially unaccompanied minors? Where are the risks? Are there risk areas where, you know, people could be disappearing to, you know, blind spots within your club? And also just, and really the safeguarding officers also communicating to your membership. So for example, if you don't have separate changing rooms for minors, then it's communicating that to your membership and having signs up that state, you know, everyone uses the change rooms, you know, recommending to the adults that their children come already dressed for sport, so that there's less risk So it's really around each and every situational analysis, looking around at the risk areas, looking at what you can do to reduce that risk, and then communicating and educating your teams and staff around that. And that's there are situations in the UK where obviously they've been going at this since 1992, that there's safeguarding officers at clubs who have actually never received a complaint or a concern, but they're very busy because they're constantly looking around and updating their different policies around how they manage things, just based on how they're assessing the risk at the club. So I'm gonna just pause there and ask if there are any questions around that side. And the only other thing I want to add is it's Haley also kind of referred to it. It's around you looking at what is practical and possible there and mitigating the risks, like same as you would do with your fire hazards and all of that. Paul?
Sorry, thanks, Ed. With regards minors being together, so I mean, you could have a 17-year-old and a 15-year-old with that. Does it talk to any of that? Or is it only adults minor?
Yeah, it's adult and minor, and it comes under the travel section as well, where we'll talk to it around no over 18 sharing with under 18s. I know it's like you don't just suddenly reach 18 and then suddenly it's like switch hits. We get that, really to the law there is the difference between a minor, and that's why we talk about vulnerable adults, because we mustn't be ignorant to the fact that young adults are also vulnerable adults, as they don't have the experience of adulthood. So, but yes, there's a difference between a 17-year-old and a 9-year-old. So, it's just managing those things in the best way. So the next one, I've just put together 2 other policies. So that is the communications and social media side, as well as the photography, video, and use of images. So I feel like we've been working in this space for quite a while now, and I think a lot of people already understand, and with Papia coming in and the great work that's been done across the industry, and that is just people's understanding that you do need to have all permissions in order to use any photography and videos on social media. The biggest thing around communication is, and this is just, again, it's talking to poor practice, and the more you allow poor practice, then it could become unacceptable conduct, is there really should not be adults communicating with minors directly. If I understand that when you're touring on a team and you have minors, and it's like minors, 16, 17-year-olds who've got cell phones, and it's the easiest way to talk to them directly, you need to have their parents on that same group. And the team manager should not be, for example, communicating directly with the minor without the parent being included into it. And that is really for the team manager, coach, the adult's protection. And it just, because it is poor practice, and it opens the ability for abuse to take place. And then the last thing, I remember listening to a legal person around social media. Obviously, social media was hitting and everything like that. And I'll never forget what she said. And she said, whenever you're going to post anything, and that includes WhatsApp, which is a form of social media and communication, is imagine whatever you're writing, put onto a big sign billboard on the side of the highway with your face as a picture, and whatever you've written next to it on a big billboard on the side of the highway, where everyone driving past can read and see who you are and read what you said. And if you're happy for it to go up there, then hit post or send. And if it's not something that you would like to go up on that highway signpost, then don't post it. So I've always found that quite useful to just remember, especially around social media and, photography and videos. Just, take a double look at the photograph and make sure that there's nothing compromising in it or anything. And then, so those are the kind of essentials around this section. Right, so the next section is around the travel guidelines. So the policy states that you should have a chaperone of the same gender. But again, this goes down to risk assessments as well. So if there is a specific reason or as to why there might not be a chaperone of the same gender, that just needs to be documented with the assessment. And then, for example, if you do have a team that travels with a chaperone of a different gender, then it's best practice to get every single one of those athletes together with their parents to sign that they are comfortable and consent to having the chaperone of a different gender traveling with them. The chaperones need to have done safeguarding training. They need to be vetted. There should be signed codes of conduct and consent forms, as well as indemnity forms. And GolfRSA has done a lot of work in updating their codes of conduct, the indemnity forms and everything around, and their waivers around their terms of competition and everything at tournaments. The unions are absolutely welcome to go and borrow those and use them for within their union as well. And then in the policy, as we've talked to as well, it says no under 18s are to share a room with over 18s. And again, this goes down to risk assessment. So I can tell you that when I was with gymnastics, we had one international team where we actually assessed the risk, and we chose for an underage female athlete to share with the female coach. And that was due to the actual risk assessments around the country that they were in, the types of accommodation that they were in, the types of competition that they were taking part in. So it was a youth age group. The girl was 12 years old, first time ever overseas in Japan, in a country that isn't English, isn't the main language, at a competition where in a hotel where we didn't know the setup, and where there were athletes from 12 years old to 19 years old running around. And it was assessed that actually it was potentially more dangerous for her to be alone in this hotel room with 19-year-old boys running around than it was for her to be sharing with the mother of 2 children who'd been vetted and trained in safeguarding. So again, that's an example of how there is a policy in place around it, but it is all about risk assessment. And so you have to take each case in its own. And so then that was documented, and all the proofs and everything was backed up by that decision that was made just on that one occasion. Otherwise, everything else has been, as per policy. Okay, so the next section is talks of the policy talks about the types of harassment and abuse. And this is the part that is the most important for every party of abuse. So there is sexual harassment, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, physical abuse, neglect, and then we've also added financial abuse. So if you do the IIC training, they won't talk to financial abuse, but it very much is part of the sporting landscape as well. So the importance of defining harassment and abuse is that then you can act on people's behavior and breaches, because you have a very clear definition about what harassment and abuse is. So just to be a little bit more interactive, so get your typing fingers out, and in the chat, I'm going to stop sharing now, is what do you think is the most prevalent form of harassment and abuse in sports? I'll go back to this page here, and I'd be interested to know, and don't look at what anybody else has written, just write for yourself, what harassment and abuse do you think is the most prevalent out of interest? Yeah, so we have financial, we have psychological, sexual and verbal abuse. Anyone else has it a guess? Intimidation, psychological or mental, bullying, mostly verbal, psychological. Okay, so the literature tells us that it is psychological abuse, that it is the most prevalent and is also at the core of all other abuses. So psychological abuse is threats, intimidation, body shaming, constant criticism, favoritism, focusing on performance and results over a person's well-being, swearing at somebody, putting them down, embarrassing somebody, humiliating them, gossiping, telling lies about people, shouting at them in an angry or critical manner. So often there's a misconception that sexual abuse or the criminal behavior is the most prevalent because that's obviously what gets the most media coverage. But the psychological abuse, and often because this is just the base, it's the poor practice, it's what's just constantly happening underneath. And then in no particular order, but obviously you have psychological abuse, which would be examples of hitting, slapping, physically restraining somebody, drug abuse, excessive exercise, so forcing somebody to train injured would be physical abuse, hitting them with an object, choking them, strangling them, shaking them, restraining someone forcefully. So then sexual harassment and abuse. So harassment doesn't have to be physical. So often in the grooming process, people will normalize sexual conversations. They will expose athletes to nudity, to watching pornography, and so grooming them in towards the process of actual sexual abuse, but without any physical touch as such. You also get verbal, sexual harassment, so making derogatory or demeaning jokes, ridiculing or sexist jokes. And what's often been experienced with coaches is coaches making comments about athletes as they develop through puberty. Oh, I see you're not a little girl anymore, and making comments like that. There's also nonverbal abuse that happens, so whistling, sexual staring or leering, making unwanted telephone calls or messages of a sexual nature. And then there's obviously the physical act of touching, unwanted physical contact, and attempted rape and rape. So then you also get neglect. So this would be in sport, like denying medical treatment. So someone's hurt themselves and they're actually just not given the medical treatment that they're required. It can be withholding food or water. It can even be sacrificing their future by not giving them an education, ignoring people, being socially excluded. And in golf, one that it can actually also mean your insurance doesn't cover you is not actually getting golfers off the field when you're in a lightning and thunderstorm. So that is actually neglectful behavior. And then the last one is we've added is financial abuse. So in sport, obviously, there's the risk of fraud or extortion, withholding money, or even controlling the budget that is a negative outcome, as opposed to looking after the athletes. So psychological abuse is at the core, and it's the most prevalent, and is generally, if anyone reports in the literature around physical abuse, there's always often a component of psychological abuse that goes with it. And if there's sexual harassment, there's always been a process of grooming and psychological abuse that's happened before that. So it's very common to find more than one form of harassment and abuse happening at the same time. The methods and impacts of harassment and abuse in sports, so they can happen as I talked to in person, with contact or no contact. the biggest one that is happening in sports and is really creating a heck of a lot of issues is the online and cyberbullying and harassment that's happening. It's gone so far as the IOC's even got AI technology that's trying to work with the athletes, say like in the Olympics or at a major event, where they're on social media, they're actually catching people's negative comments and harassment and abuse towards those athletes before it even appears on their social media accounts. And it's managing to pick up that, but it's a whole industry in itself. And as we know, those of us with children, what's happening with online abuse on cell phones amongst peers is just ravaging. Neglect or negligence, there's bullying, as someone raised as well, and which is, behavior between peers, and we'll talk to that. But that is another form that's got to be shut down. Our poor practice got to be shut down as quickly as possible, as it just can spiral out of control. Hazing, so I'm sure we're all aware of what hazing is, but it is very much a form of harassment. Grooming, of making the emotional connection with the purpose of abuse. And then in sport, Ripley couldn't believe it, but there's many documented cases of human trafficking using sport as the tool. So football is a huge one, where with promises of going to these special academies, and the athletes end up being trafficked into sex rings. And this is the harassment abuse is always based on some kind of a power difference. So that might be in sex or gender, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, disability, age. It can even be around athletic ability. So the research also shows that the better an athlete becomes, the more at risk they are for abuse. Athlete longevity, so the longer that you're in, their faith and their socio-economical and financial statements are all risk factors. The impact of harassment and abuse on athletes actually is in a number of ways. So it can impact them physically, where they have illnesses and injuries, they lose their performance drops, they can have disordered eatings, PTSD, they can self-harm. They can have cognitive effects, so they have low self-esteem, emotional effects, so they can become volatile and have mood swings. It can be behavioral, like they suddenly now want to cheat or drop out, which they've never wanted to do before. It has effects on their mental health, so their anxiety, depression, and even so far as suicide. Their relational it impacts their relational situation, so they can feel socially excluded or marginalized, feel like they're the only one that it's happening to, and there can also be economic loss in that the fact that it impacts in so many different ways, and that's just to the athletes. In the literature, it's actually in a lot of ways the impacts of harassment abuse are actually the same for boys and girls. So we mustn't just think that it's girls that are at the most risk. It is in different sections if you break it down. So the literature, some of the research shows that girls are more at risk for psychological and sexual abuse and neglect, although there are some studies where in I think it was Kenyan football, like the boys had a higher sexual abuse rate. But boys are more at risk for physical abuse, and we know that from like the bullying that happens and physical bullying that happens. The impacts are research shows all of it, that the impacts are long-lasting, profound, and diverse, and it doesn't just actually impact the athletes, it impacts their parents, their coaches, their friends, as in their entourage, the community, the organization. The Larry Nassar case impacted the entire country and the world, actually. And then for organizations, we've talked to the reputational damage, the loss of players and fans, the loss of sponsorship, There can be reduced medal tallies, reduced public confidence in the sport, loss of trust, and asset depreciation. So that's really and all of this has come from research out there. So the things around harassment and abuse is this happens in every sport. There is not one sport that this does not happen in. It happens at all levels. It happens worldwide. And it really is reflected around persons in power. And the literature is showing almost now that it is as much, if now not more, than coach to athlete abuse. It happens to both men and women, and it's around an imbalance of power. So sport is incredibly vulnerable because you have these numerous situations of differences in power. And my one thing is that in this section, like peer-to-peer low-level abuse really has to not be tolerated, as it really just is like that core center of the psychological abuse. So I'm going to pause there for a second and just see if there's any. Yes, Paul, often by parents. So interestingly enough, I will share, I looked up research for golf specific, and the only article I could find was a research paper. I think it was 57 or 67 high level or high performing female athletes around the abuse experienced by their parents, and listed the verbal and psychological, physical, and neglect experienced by those athletes. So yeah, it really is in the whole realm, and it's a minefield in managing that. Again, full Durgatun from when he was at Arsenal Football Academy, and I can share it as well. I've got the link to it, but he took all their academy players, so all the under 18s, and he asked them to write a letter to their parents. And I mean, it wasn't really to their parents, he connected it. And he asked them to say, I love it when you, and they had to finish the sentence. I hate it when you, and they had to finish the sentence. I wish you would, and they had to finish the sentence. And thank you for, and they had to finish the sentence. And then he took all the answers and he created a video with an infographic on it. In my opinion, every single parent of any child who is doing sport should watch this video. It's incredible, and makes one pause. The next section is around just recognizing and responding. So like, what are the indicators of abuse? My screen is so if you're in an environment and suddenly an athlete has really unexplained injuries, inconsistent reasons for injuries, if someone's raising a concern about another person, regularly, if there is a child who you're coming across that has really inappropriate sexual awareness, or they're fearing and really lack of trusting in adults, if they have, there are excessive fears of making mistakes, difficulties making friends, or something preventing them from socializing, sudden weight loss or gain, or variations in eating, then those are all, again, like kind of categorized, and it's could be indicators of abuse. Obviously, every single one of those are not in itself necessarily indicators of abuse, but just be aware, of these type of issues that you might come across, and a lot of it you'll also feel in your gut, like, oh, I think there's something wrong here, and just to be aware of it and then be on the kind of lookout. That doesn't mean going to make accusations, but just to be aware that these are kind of documented indicators of abuse. So if someone comes to you and they are now raising a concern, especially what we call a high level concern, like of sexual assault, in the policy we talk to, just some tips on how to respond to the person. This person, you need to ensure that they feel safe, listen carefully, don't interrupt them. One of the big things that you can't do is to promise to keep their secrets. Because if this is a sexual assault against a minor, you are obliged by law to report it. So you can't keep their secret. So it is important to explain to them that you may have to share, but that, and the biggest things that victims ask for as well is that you say that you believe them, and that they are brave for coming forward to talk to you. Try and keep your questions at a minimum, so not to lead or direct them. If you're trying to understand more, just really open-ended questions like and anything else. Reassure them that they've done the right thing and that you believe them, and show them that they've been taken seriously. So, set your phone aside, be present with them, and then explain to them what the next steps are. So what is the next thing that you're going to do, and how are you going to help them? The actions to avoid are just dismissing the concern, panicking, showing alarm or distaste as they're talking to you, and having leading questions or probing, promising to keep their secret, and also making assumptions on their side. So if they're not giving you a lot of information, you need to try and create as much of a safe space to let them be comfortable to share more with you, but don't just, if they haven't said something, don't just read that as being something else. It is not your job necessarily to approach the accused that they're talking to and deal with the situation. It's to follow through the channels. Don't conduct a personal investigation. I think the most important thing, and this is, also for those who are just working in your general club, is it's not for them to try and solve it. It's to bring it to your safeguarding officers or your managers, attention as to what they've seen, what they've heard, and hand over as much information as possible to that person for them to deal with it, and the person who's the best to respond. Don't make any negative comments of the accused. And then with regards to it, is quickly afterwards record everything in writing. Try and record how they said it in their words, what date and time, the names that they mentioned, who you passed on the information to, and also you can try and note if there's certain facts or hearsay or opinions, and then sign and date the records. And then, it's important even for poor practice to be reported, because even though that might just mean that there is a verbal outcome and response as to that poor practice, if it's documented, you can document consistent poor performance across things, because that can be an indication of grooming and further unacceptable conduct. It is always best practice to take things to an independent case management team. You can have that set up in your clubs or your unions yourself, as well. Always to check against the policies and the code of conduct of what's been breached, because that's like empirical data. And then how do we improve and educate, from what we learn with all of this. If there happen to be internal investigations and disciplinary actions, often you learn where there's a gap in your policy or something needs to be updated. And when you're responding to a concern, it is the most frustrating thing, and the thing that victims talk to the most is that these responses take a long time. It goes through the processes. Everyone who's fighting for the victim try to make sure that all the I's are dotted, all the T's are crossed, and that ends up taking time. So it's keeping in constant communication to the victims, so that they know that the process is moving along. And the other thing around safeguarding cases is the incredible need for confidentiality. So keeping everything as confidential as possible, and it's only those who are involved in the process that know what's happening, for this the safety and welfare of both the victim and the alleged perpetrator. So I'm just gonna, and then this is just a reminder that we have that safeguarding line, and it's also on our health page on our website. So how do we safeguard, especially as a club? And again, I can't emphasize enough that from a club perspective, at every organization, it's around risk assessment. So you need to understand and analyze what is harassment and abuse. So really unpacking and understanding what are the different forms of harassment and abuse. What are the risks in our country? Because our country is very different to other countries. What are the risks in our sport? Because our sport is different to other sports. What are the risks in our club? What are the risks in our community where our club is based? Because that does impact the club, and what are the other risks that are out there? So I think first and foremost, the clubs can really just go and look at what are your different areas of risk. And you've got this GolfRSA, safeguarding policy. It's really essential that you have some kind of policies in place. You will see if you go through all of the lists of things on the website, there is like a one-pager, there's 1 or 2 pager that says where a club can just sign to say, we agree and abide by the GolfRSA policy. So it can take you months and months and months to come up with your own policy, which it is important for you to have your own policy, but you can go through each of ours and look at how does it work for you? What is your change room policy? What is your travel policy? Are you following the same recruitment process? Are you adding other things? Are you following the same code of conduct? Do you have a different code of conduct? What's your disciplinary policy? We've updated our code of conduct. It's an ethics code. It's on the website. We've done the same with our disciplinary code. It's absolutely all-inclusive. But there might be areas from your club that you need to add onto that. So it's how do you not reinvent the wheel, but also make your own wheels for your car. It's really important that you educate everyone, like everyone. And I'm going to give you a link to some basic awareness training through the IOC, and you get a certificate that comes out afterwards. And we're going to also be running our own awareness, and we want to do training in the unions to have people who can deliver the awareness training in person, because then you can do really nice role plays and case scenarios. And you need to have a manner to deal with reports. You're going to get reports that come in at your club, and I'm sure you've been dealing with them in many different ways. So what is your process so that you are covered? And then, as I've said continuously, it's a continuous risk assessment. Look at your risk assessment, decide which are the priority actions, how are you going to reduce those risks, put your action plan in place, and then just analyze again and repeat and update and so on and so forth. So this screen should now make a bit more sense, having talked through everything around having your policies, your response mechanism, so your ability to respond, having your safeguarding officers and your independent case management team. How do you prevent? So your prevention methods of vetting, your codes of conduct, your ethics and disciplinary codes, your education and communication. So how are you promoting, the safety of and welfare of your membership? So are you educating all your staff at this purpose? Are you educating the members, the athletes, the parents, the support personnel, the, food and beverage staff? And then how are things going? Are you monitoring and evaluating? How are things going? And then that leads back to updating your policy and your response mechanisms and your prevention and your education, and so we go on. So this is the link for the athletes, safeguarding athletes from harassment and abuse IOC course. That it covers what is harassment and abuse, recognizing the signs, does a bit of a case study, understanding your role and what organizations can do. And it really is like the simplest awareness process. We have a page with the safeguarding policies and reporting procedures. You can use all the templates that are on there. We will update it this week with all the vetting guidelines and the forms as well. And then when you're having to deal with reports, ask for help. Like, I don't know how many times I contact Haley to say, help. Can we chat through this? I've had people doing the same with me. The more we work together and the more we collaborate, the better we're going to be at all of this. So the IOC uses this just as another metaphoric thing. So every type of policy, risk assessment, recruitment, they call it the Swiss cheese metaphor, is like a piece of Swiss cheese. So when you have a recruitment process in place, when you have education and training for all your stakeholders, it's like a piece of Swiss cheese that's been put up. So you've got a code of conduct, you've got a mandatory, reporting policy, you've appointed a safeguarding officer. So here is the harmful person, and here is the athlete, and you try and put up all these pieces of Swiss cheese, which are never beautiful whole pieces. They've all got these little holes in them. But if you line up enough of this perpetrator to get to the victim, they also talk to having some enablers. So you might have people who are not helping along the process. They're actually eating away at the cheese and making more holes. And they're called enablers. So they're enabling the perpetrator, like they don't call up poor practice, or they're not interested in having vetting done. And ultimately, in this scenario here, the education and training stop the perpetrator. So he managed to get through the policy, he managed to get through the risk assessment and the recruitment process, but someone who was educated pulled him up and he never got to the victim. So the more layers that we can place, the harder it is for perpetrators to thrive in our industry. And that means in general what they do is, like, you can't stop them from criminal conduct, but they'll move to another place. So I like to finish on this note. If you had to think about the person or people who are the most important for you in your life, the person that you love the most in this world, essentially, when you want to know what are you supposed to do in a situation, you close your eyes and you think of them and you think, what would I want someone to do for them in this situation? And generally, you will probably come up with the right way forwards.